Your picture could be taken nearly anywhere, anytime. Cameras are everywhere. You probably have a camera in your pocket right now. It would be nearly impossible to find a new cell phone that wasn't also a camera. Even before cell phones, there were disposable cameras and Polaroid cameras. Photography has really been simplified and made portable so that anyone could take a picture. Before these innovations, photographs were taken primarily by professionals and enthusiasts. Thanks to my mother, I've been a photography enthusiast since I can remember. I've even won a few awards for my photographs in Ohio art competitions. This picture behind me in particular has won quite a few awards. I'm very proud of it. Anyway, pre-Polaroid, photography was primarily an art form. Like a painter uses brushstrokes and certain pigments and paint types to create their art, a photographer has camera settings such as aperture and shutter speed at their disposal, which they manipulate to get the image they desire. There's much more to photography than just pointing and shooting. So obviously there's much more to painting than using a certain brushstroke or picking a paint. There's more to photography than pointing and shooting, but still these camera settings, aperture and shutter speed, are very important to how the image ends up looking. I'll start by explaining some of the fundamentals of how a film camera works. John Hedgecoe, a best-selling author of books on photography, describes light as essential to photography in his 1993 book, Photography Basics. When you take a picture, light is let into the camera and it causes a chemical reaction on the frame of film. It exposes the film and forms an image. Now, when you push the button on your camera, it opens the shutter. The shutter is basically a piece of metal that serves as a barrier between the light and the frame of film. When the shutter opens, it allows the film to be exposed to the light. So the amount of light that is let in by the shutter has an influence on how the picture looks. If too much light is let in, the image will look washed out. If not enough light is let in, the image will be too dark. Now there are two camera settings in particular that influence the shutter and the amount of light that is let into the camera. The first of these settings is called shutter speed. Shutter speed refers to how long the shutter is open after pushing the button on your camera. Film is very sensitive and only requires a small amount of light to work, and for this reason, shutter speed is measured in hundredths of a second. The shutter is the noise that you hear when you take a picture. It's the shutter opening and closing, the shutter has an influence on how the picture looks. In this photograph by Gregory Maxwell, a shutter speed of 1/3 of a second was used. Now this is incredibly slow shutter speed. Notice how the water looks very smooth and like almost silky. This is because the shutter was open for a relatively long amount of time, and so it captured the image of the water in more than one place because the water was moving while the shutter was open. This is why it looks sort of silky. Now in this photograph, also by Gregory Maxwell, a shutter speed of 1/200th of a second was used. Now, this is still sort of slow for a shutter speed, but it's much quicker than 1/3 of a second, and for this reason you can see that the water is much more defined, like you can see individual drops of it. But this is the reason, shutter speed is the reason that people may look blurred in a picture, is they were moving while the shutter was open, and so the camera captured their image in more than one place on the frame of film. This is also the reason that in the very early days of photography, people had to hold incredibly still while having their picture taken, because film wasn't as sensitive to light then, so the shutter needed to be open for a much longer amount of time for the film to be exposed properly. The second setting that has an influence on the shutter and the amount of light let into the camera is called aperture. Now, aperture refers to how wide the shutter opens when you take a picture. The measurement for aperture is some really complex mathematical formula that I wouldn't even bother trying to figure out, but it basically comes down to the smaller the number, the wider the aperture is open. This is on a scale of 2.8 to 32. As with shutter speed, aperture has an influence on how the picture looks. It allows for different extremes of what is called depth of field. Now in this photograph by Flagstaff Photos, an aperture of 5.6 was used. This is a relatively low number for aperture, which means that the shutter is open very far. You can see that hardly anything is in focus but the flower. This is what is called a shallow depth of field. Photographers typically use a shallow depth of field when they want your attention to be drawn to one part of the image and one part only. Now, in this photograph, also by Flagstaff Photos, an aperture of 32 was used. Now this is the largest possible aperture setting, which means that the shutter is open only very, very, very tiny bit. Because of this being a much larger number, you can see that a great deal more in the photograph is in focus. It has a greater depth of field. So to summarize, light is essential to photography. It causes film to have a chemical reaction which creates an image. When taking a photo, the shutter is open either a very little bit or a lot, and for either a short amount of time or a longer amount of time. Either way, it's a really small amount of time. So depending on the settings you choose, the resulting image will be either fairly sharp or soft, and you will have either a shallow or great depth of field. So as you can see, there's much more to photography than just pointing and shooting. And though cameras are everywhere these days, and you probably have one in your pocket right now, photography, luckily, is still a form of art that is both unique and versatile.